Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the third day of our third week of Wrapped in Grace, the birth story that changes everything. We're talking this week about naming the baby and the sound of Jesus' name and the way that God connected those ancient, hopeful promises and stories of the Old Testament and personified his salvation in Jesus. And so we're going to look today at some more of those great connections. We're going to go back to Hannah's story and her son Samuel. And the title today is called Ancient New Story, How God Connects the Pieces. God is an incredible author. The way he tells his story makes my heart beat faster. When God said yes to Hannah's plea for a son, he wasn't just writing a great story for Hannah. God's story arc is so much broader than what can be contained in any one human life. Ancient stories that appear to be complete in themselves often show up centuries later to shape and influence new stories. We know that Hannah's prayer became a pattern for Mary's prayer, but there may be another connection to the Christmas story. You can read Hannah's complete story in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. For the women of Hannah's day, childlessness implied that God had withheld his blessing. Hannah believed she was a failure. Couple that despair with the abusive taunting of her husband's other wife who did have children, and you will begin to understand the gut-wrenching battle that brought Hannah to her knees that day at the tabernacle. When Hannah prayed to ask God for a son, she was begging God to fight for her. Her value was intertwined with her ability to give birth. Hannah was willing to give her son back to God, if only he would restore the wholeness that her soul desperately longed for. God's yes to Hannah's prayer is an outrageous display of his extraordinary love to those who seek him. Within a year, Hannah held a baby in her arms. She had a new prayer to offer and a new song to sing. She had a son to give back to God. Hannah's story is the beginning of Samuel's story. If Hannah hadn't struggled to have children, would she have been compelled to offer her firstborn son as an offering to God? Samuel became a key player in God's story. He grew up in the house of God at Shiloh. As a child, he learned to hear God's voice, and Eli the priest taught young Samuel how to respond to God with these words: "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that story is in 1 Samuel chapter 3. I wonder if Mary ever thought about what it would be like to actually hear God's voice and to respond to him as a servant. When Gabriel announced to Mary that she had been chosen to bear God's son, was her response, "I am your servant," shaped by her love of Samuel's ancient story? Both Samuel and Mary, at very young ages, willingly submitted themselves as servants to the call of God. When God said yes to Hannah, was he writing the story that would one day influence Mary to say yes to becoming his birth mom? God's story spans generations. Ancient stories become templates and tutors for our stories, and God weaves them together to tell his bigger story of grace. Our lifetime stories are segments in his grand story of redemption. I love that. I love that those ancient stories become templates and tutors for our stories, and that God uses our stories to become templates and tutors for the lives of people who will come after us. What centers me, when life feels disjointed, it's so good to remember that God's got it all together and everything's going to fit together to make sense. This is our journaling question for today. What stories have shaped your faith and helped you to find your place in God's story? Who's been your tutor? What templates have you followed? And who's going to follow the pattern that you've set? I love that. I love that when Hannah prayed, she asked God to fight for her. The language that she used, she called him Jehovah Sabaoth. That's Lord God of the hosts of heaven, the hosts of the armies of heaven. We read Jehovah Sabaoth a lot in the prophets when God needs to fight for Israel. But the first time we see that name is Hannah's prayer. And she asked God to fight for her. She was desperate, but her desperation took her to a place where she was willing to give her son back to God. And then Samuel became the spokesperson for God to Israel. And in his childhood, when Eli taught Samuel to say yes to God, maybe he was also teaching Mary. And he certainly has taught us. I remember learning that verse as a little girl and teaching it to my children. Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So how great that it's one story that God's telling, and we get to be a part of it. I hope you guys have a good day, and I will be back tomorrow with day 4. See you then.